Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, January 19th, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past 7 days. First up, how do we talk to international students about safety? Second, what do falling numbers at the undergraduate level mean in the United States? And finally, how significant is India to Western colleges? We'll answer these 3 questions and more on the Midweek Roundup for Wednesday, January 19th, 2022. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us for the Midweek Roundup. It's always our pleasure to be coming to you, whether live on Facebook or on repeat on our YouTube channel or our Facebook page, as well as those are faithful podcast listeners. We're glad to have you a part of our SMIE consulting family. So let's get right to our first question of the day. And this is a question that is at the core of admission officers around the U.S., around the world, that have to address the issue of safety when it comes to international students, and that what you do it also for your domestic students, I'm sure, depending on where you are in the country or where you are in the world. And for me, in my now 28 years of working in higher education, I began as a domestic admissions counselor at my alma mater, Marquette University in Milwaukee. Urban environment, our campus literally right adjacent to the downtown area of the city. Also some areas of around our campus that were not the most well-developed, and certainly some of the poorer areas of town were very in close proximity to our campus. So this was an issue that as an admissions counselor, certainly as a student, it was something we learned in our early days at that university. But when it comes to how do we talk about safety for international students that likely don't have the perspective on the issue of safety the same way we do, depending on where they are coming from in the world, depending on their background, those types of issues, how are we talking about it? And I've seen in the matter of my career, the issue of safety, depending on where I was, what institution I was working for, where they were located in the country, I've seen it talked about at least 3 or 4 different ways in terms of what safety actually meant. And that's part of the challenge. We can think very broadly that for our domestic students, when we talk about safety, we're talking about campus crime, we're talking about the neighborhood around our campuses. These types of things are what we have to communicate effectively to our prospective students. What I always thought when I was a student at Marquette, going into a university in a big city, that I needed to be aware of my surroundings. That was one of the first lessons I learned while on campus, that there are parts of town that there's no reason for you to go to, particularly at night, and putting yourself at risk. They're just things that you wouldn't do. You pick that up during your orientation sessions and during the first few days and weeks on campus. But you also realize that as an institution, you have a responsibility to provide for the safety of your students. And going to college in the 80s, when there was the big debates on whether universities should have their own campus police, we did at Marquette. We call them public safety. They weren't officially police, but they were public safety officers. But we had significant safety procedures in place. We had what we call blue light phones all over campus that we could call and then report something. It would be a kind of a hotline to our public safety officers. We also had what we called our limo service. These were basically blue vans that went all the way around the campus area and immediate area adjacent to campus to take students to and from areas that they would need to go to for various activities. So there were things that the university did put in place to help protect us as students. So that's something that when I became an admissions officer for the university, and I would talk about crime in Milwaukee, when that question would come up, I would talk about all these services that we had in place and becoming aware of your surroundings. And this is learning how to live in a city. This is when you go new places, do you take precautions when you don't know the area? Yes. So talking about that. And the reason I bring this up today as a topic is I look at what I learned at Marquette and how when I started doing international recruitment, the issue of safety tended to be, okay, you're in a big city. We've heard stories about crime in America. It's running rampant, all of these things. How does that play out? That was the topic that we discussed, was personal safety, taking care of your possessions and what to do, what not to do, learning where to go, where not to go, those types of things. That was how we talked about it. And we should keep in mind that in the United States, U.S. colleges are required to report campus crime statistics. There's a national database of this. And this database has been used and is used by universities and colleges to talk about how good of a job they're doing with campus safety. There's a database that they call it. The U.S. Department of Education Campus Safety and Security Survey. That's the source of these campus crime statistics. One of the folks out there, service providers, one of the major pathway providers in the U.S., Shorelight, they've come up with what they're calling the University Safety Index, and they've plotted along a graph of safest to least safe or somewhat safe. They don't have anybody below somewhat safe. They talk about the locations of these institutions and where they are compared to how safe they are, based on this U.S. Department of Education campus safety and security survey. So the report does show that there's been significant drops in like auto theft and burglary and robbery have decreased in the last 20 years. But what isn't reported is that there have also been there have been significant increases in sex offenses on this 65% from since in a 5-year period from 2014 to 2019. But that's not reported in this index. What is also not reported is when you look at, and this is the dichotomy that when we talk about safety on university campuses, we can rely on these campus security, the campus safety and security report, because that data is all that's required for colleges and universities to report. Colleges and universities are not required to report the surrounding community that they live in, because they don't have control over that necessarily. They don't always have control over what goes on their own campus, but what has to be reported is what Shorelight is using for this campus safety, how safe are U.S. campuses article, and put the links to the initial Shorelight report and then a critique of it by a colleague who was out of the UK. He's actually previously worked for one of these pathway providers, not Shorelight, out of the UK, but he has done some critical analysis on some various stories around the world, and he's one of the first out there talking about agent aggregators and what they look like, and some of the potential threats that agent aggregators pose to institutions and quality control and all of these other things. But also, he's taking a look now at how safety is talked about through the Shorelight Index, University Safety Index. And on the top, the graph goes, as I mentioned, the categories of safety. There is one category on the lowest ebb is somewhat safe. Then there's safe. Then there's quite safe. I think. Anyway, it's an interesting combination. But on the safest category, they also rank. They all have a sliding scale on number of international students, more international students, less international students. So in the most international students, in the most safe category, you have Washington D.C. as the place for the safest campuses are in Washington D.C. And Alan Priest is the commentator who is critiquing this Shorelight piece, Shorelight Safety Index. And he says, well, he quotes some of the very real statistics about Washington D.C. being having the most violent crime rate per 100,000 inhabitants in 2020. So one of Shorelight's partners, American University, is in D.C. And they've put Washington D.C. in the safest category with the most international students. So interesting to see this report after I think Washington D.C. I think they have Vermont in that safest category as the next highest percentage international and safety-wise. So it's really interesting how his critique of the Shorelight University Safety Index, but it reflects for me going back 28 years in the industry when I started talking about this issue, is how safety is thought about overseas is going to be different depending on who you're talking to at the time you're talking to them. When my wife and I, we moved to England after immediately after we got married. It was our honeymoon. Both working at an international school outside of London. And every school break, we're going to a different place in Europe. And we're visiting places that I'd traveled to as a recruiter before, and that was great for us. But what was interesting about safety, as we talked about it there, it was in a very suburban, nearly rural, but a very rural campus, very wide open campus, lots of acreage, sports fields, all of that. But a very safe campus. We had guards at the gates, and it was a pricey school that a lot of expats sent their children to. Over half the school, well over half the school were non-Americans. It was an American-style school. I had IB in the high school. It was a pre-K through 12th grade, so it had a boarding school element as well. So very, very well-known school. And safety there was a non-issue, really. It was minor theft and things that happened between students in the boarding area, that type of thing. But nothing really ever rose to the level of what we considered an important safety issue. We moved back to the U.S., and we moved to South Bend, Indiana. I was working at St. Mary's College, right across the street from Notre Dame. And safety there, I learned from a couple of my colleagues who had been there for a number of years, who had done some international recruitment. When they had the safety talk, so for those not familiar with South Bend, it's a medium-sized city, but on the north end of where the campuses are, a very rural area, very suburban rural area. So nothing too outlandish. There are certainly parts of South Bend that students never really went to, and as any urban area might have. Nothing there for them to do, and certainly would be just you learn where not to go, where to go, and wherever you go. But when a colleague who had done some international travel for this institution before I arrived, she was talking to a family. Not sure if it was in Latin America or if it was in China, but they asked the question about how safe is the campus there in South Bend. It's actually Notre Dame, Indiana was the postal code. But then the representative was talking from St. Mary's was talking about, well, it's in a very safe and secure environment. It's a campus removed from main road. Very residence halls are secure. Very little crime on that front. On that front, and then the parents said, no, we've been hearing about all these tornadoes that come through. And that was the level of concern the parents and our student, who I can't remember who it was who was asking about it. But the question was really about safety from weather. And that is a very different perspective on safety than most U.S. colleges representatives, when they're talking about safety to overseas students and parents, would have to have. But yeah, learning that first, in some places in the world, they hear stories about tornadoes, and in the Midwest, yes, there are tornadoes every once in a while, and had we had any in South Bend, and that was how we had to respond to that question. But moving from that campus to another in Indiana, we were part of the Destination Indiana State Consortium for International Education, promoting the state as a destination for international students. There was a time post 9/11 where anyone who was working on campus at that time knew that you needed to be looking out for your Muslim students, particularly your Arab students, male Arab students on your campus, because they were targets of hate crimes, and if not worse. And that was something that was particularly concerning to us as obviously international educators, that we had to make sure our students were taken care of. There were things we wanted to do to help them be more secure in their environments, that things that they needed to know, and about the campus area, and just about the kinds of issues that they had heard stories about. Traffic stops for male Muslim students were really out of order, and there was a significant concern. And post 9/11, that tapped into a lot of frustration, much like we saw with Trump's election. There was a lot of frustration, reaction that was caused with some of his travel bans, calling them Muslim travel bans. There are highlights of that we saw post 9/11 happening during the Trump administration. So that those kinds of issues become very significant. We've also seen in recent years, certainly again with the Trump administration, anti-Asian crime, Asian hate crimes against Asians, East Asians, has certainly been on the rise during the Trump administration, and there's hangover effect into the Biden administration as well, because the politics were pushing that agenda, that there was this trade war going on with China, a cultural war going on with China. And then there was the virus that started in China, and how everything, there were elements of American society that reacted to that. And when the president said it's the Wuhan flu or the China flu, that became a touch point for a lot of people. And then the less educated among us that listen to that and take that on board, and really drives what they do, that became a reality for a certain element of society, and they took it out on anyone who looked Asian, East Asian, and even though they might be American citizens. That just the illogic, the irrationality of it, is nearly impossible to guard against in terms of protecting our students. But that's a reality that U.S. colleges have had to face. Remember seeing a video just a week or two ago from a student at Syracuse, a Chinese student at Syracuse University, that right at the beginning of the pandemic, when it was in February, March was when it was becoming clear that this was going to be much bigger than anyone thought it was going to be, and that this is when Chinese students were starting to become under threat. She recorded a song in Chinese, recorded a video of her on campus offering hugs at the beginning of the pandemic with a mask on. She was fully masked the whole time, to students, and it was a message of love and not of fear, and that she would wear a blindfold and wear her mask and offer hugs to people who just needed that touch point. So that kind of thing is really was a safety is and has been a safety concern for Chinese students, and there's there was an article that we'll reference we referenced in our newsletter this week, all the SMIE news fit to share. I talked about this issue of the issue of crime against Chinese students. There have been 2 Chinese students murdered in the last year on or near their college campuses, and that's increasingly impacting Chinese students. Whether that's actually quantifiable or there was an international education agency based in China that put out this, was quoted in the Pi News article about this, and that they're saying it's negatively impacting Chinese student interest. And then there are these articles appear fairly regularly whenever there's this kind of a issue. When a Chinese student was murdered down at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, Urbana-Champaign, that was a big fear then, that Chinese students would stay away. But they have they haven't been coming into the U.S. In as great a numbers as they have been in the past, but had already been a trend that had been on the way down since probably 2014, 2015, where they probably peaked in the U.S. So we'll see what happens with this safety issue, but the real concern here is, are we defining what we're talking about when we're talking about safety with students from particular areas, because it may be different than what we're thinking. So it's always good to just take a beat and think about, okay, answer that question. What are you talking when you think about safety? What are you thinking about? What is motivating that question? So it's a matter of perspective, and we talk about that all the time here on the Roundup. That having the right perspective on what your audience is actually wanting to learn is really where we need to start our conversations rather than where we finish them. So that's a very interesting topic, an ongoing a topic that's not going away. Certainly been around for many decades in how we talk about international education in the United States. So moving on to our second question of the day. What do falling undergraduate numbers mean in the United States? And for those who are not on the enrollment management side, this may be more of not a news flash, but an impact of what's happening in the United States. Now, I'll back up a little bit to say that the United States goes through these cycles, as does every country, with the birth rates and when we see bubbles burst and drop-offs and cliffs and troughs and all of these wonderful sounds like weather formations. But you have these trends in your graduating student populations each year and from high school that you see. We know that in 2025, 26, there will be a demographic cliff that the U.S. will go off. And it sounds more dramatic than it is, but in certain parts of the United States that have been seeing declining populations or declining birth rates, particularly in the Northeast, some of the Midwest, with population migration to the south and the west of the United States, certain parts of the country are going to have real significant demographic drop-offs. Even some parts of the West are now going to be experiencing this in 2025. But what this means is you see when you have a declining number of your domestic students graduating from high school each year, you have a smaller population that you as an institution can go out and recruit. That would be your bread and butter, where you get the majority of your students from each year. So that drop-off causes sleepless nights for enrollment managers around the country, and they look, and institutions more broadly look for, okay, if you're a state institution and you know that that cliff is happening actually in 2024 for you because you're a year ahead of the curve in terms of declining birth rates and that type of thing. So you maybe saw this coming back in, if we're talking about 2024, we're talking about 18 years ago, 2006, there were very low birth rates in the United States. I think they're saying 2025 because they go back 17 years and they look at 2008 and the Great Recession that hit, and people weren't having babies as much. There were declining birth rates that year. So that's the logic is okay. That hasn't been hasn't been compensated by higher immigration of people with kids that age already. So when that happens, there's a demographic cliff and panic ensues on 3 or 4 years in advance of when that's happening to plan for, okay, how do we recruit students more broadly to compensate for this domestic cliff that we're going off? If you're a state school, does that mean ramping up your out-of-state recruitment in different parts of the country? And if, again, nothing happens automatically, you don't flick a switch and suddenly everybody from California will now come to your school in Rhode Island. So you think about these things on a longer term scale. One thing that a lot of colleges have done, particularly since 9/11, have looked at international students as a real source of potential growth or compensation for the loss of domestic student revenue, or at least for public schools, those ones that you're losing from your state. You're looking out of state, you're looking at international as where you need to draw your additional students from to make up for the demographic losses you're going to be facing domestically? Or do you go all in on better financial aid packages for those domestic students so you can get a greater slice of the pie? But what does that do to your discount rate and your overall net tuition revenue and all these other wonderful statistics that go flying around? So interesting to see how colleges will be responding. There is, in addition to the demographic cliff that is happening in 2 to 4 years, you also have kind of a pandemic effect here because not only are we moving towards a point where we're going to have a domestic drop-off in high school graduation numbers, we are also seeing since the beginning of the pandemic, with the economic impact it's had on the country, particularly those in the middle to lower income area brackets of domestic students and families, colleges have lost, and the Chronicle story from this that came out last week, colleges have lost more than 475,000 students during the pandemic, and that's a decline from fall 21. 2.7% drop from a year earlier, and that's a decline of 476,000. So that's combined with, in fall 2020, a 3.1% decline in new undergraduate starts or undergraduate enrollment that was down 465,000. So in the course of 2 years, we have nearly 1 million fewer enrolled students in the United States. And that's just boggles the mind when you think about it. So there's something like in terms of what those numbers that you can see the drop off kind of happening earlier. It happened most at private for-profit institution 4-year schools, and you see the least effect was at private nonprofit 4-year schools. 11% down at private for-profit 4 years, private nonprofit 4 years down only 2.2%. But overall, a 3.1% drop year on year, 2020 to 2021. So there's obviously pandemic impacts in this. There are students that are deciding to go into the workforce right away that are saying, hey, I got to help my family out, and we got to make money for our families. I got to save for my education. I can't afford to go to school right now because my parents can't afford it. All of these things are very real impacts on enrollment. So kind of a double effect with a coming domestic cliff that we're driving off in the U.S., plus what's happening with the pandemic, fewer domestic students coming. I see many more institutions cranking up their international recruitment again because they're going to have to compensate. They're either going to have to downsize their institutions, and for some that might be more realistic than others. But most are going to say, okay, we need to compensate. We need to keep our balances right in terms of our overall student populations, and international is going to be a big piece of this. One of the colleges that I've been working with over the last year, they've kind of seen this coming in terms of the domestic drop-off. they're in a part of the country that has been seeing some of the drop off, but not nearly as significant as others. Other places are expecting in the next 2 to 3 years. So, but they have identified international as a main area that they can grow, because frankly they've never done it intentionally before, and they're realizing that they can with some real change that needs to happen on the institutional level to make it a priority for their entire campus, not just 2 or 3 people in the admissions office. That you can now we can do more to bring in overseas students, but also they're looking to aggressively grow their overall population at their institutions as well. So you get colleges and presidents that come in that have these ambitious plans, and if they're backed and have support across campus, then you really see movement, and you can see some amazing things happen. But I do see this overall trend, a downward trend of undergraduate enrollments, is going to drive a lot of colleges to start seeking international markets that they can grow to compensate. And that is a good thing if you're an international educator. And if you're at an institution that understands the demographic shifts and realizes that those shifts don't happen overnight, that it takes planning, and that there is investment that's going to be needed to get you to where you want to be internationally. If you haven't been significantly active in a particular market, you're going to need to up your game and up your commitment to recruit students effectively in new markets. So that's a positive thing for international education. And in the United States, I think you're going to see more institutions that, frankly, over the last 2 to 3 years, probably had a lot of knee-jerk reactions. We've heard stories of departments, entire international recruitment offices being shuttered during the pandemic, staff laid off or let go. Senior folks had been there 20 plus years, let go. And that happened countrywide. Not everywhere, obviously, but there are a number of schools that said international pandemic's going to kill us. We need to turn off that faucet and turn something else on. Whether they've been able to do that successfully or not in the last 2 years, I doubt it. But there are going to be more institutions that might have taken that approach 2 years ago that are now going, oh, maybe that was a little premature, and we're facing this demographic cliff, and we're already down in undergraduate enrollments. We need to bump back up to what we're doing internationally. Let's hope they get there. We'll see. But a lot of moving parts, obviously, with enrollments on college campuses, and a lot of decisions that are made up the chain that may or may not impact you in a positive way. So if you're in the enrollment game. So we'll certainly keep our eyes on this and monitor these trends, because there's certainly quite a bit to think about here. And we're going to wrap up today with the third question: how significant is India to Western colleges? And this is a quick one, and I'm going to point out just a couple of brief articles that have popped in the last week. One of them is an expansion by one of the major agent providers, one of the major international education organizations, IDP. They had already had significant presence in India, India being the second largest student market in the world. They're recruiting students through IDP for Australian, UK, Canadian, US, and New Zealand institutions. They have now added. They already had, I think, about 40 plus offices in India. They've added a further 23 offices, now have expanded into a number of tier 2, tier 3 cities, that many of which, and for me, I've been recruiting in India since 2005. Some of these places I've never heard of, and not that I'm an India expert, but having traveled there for 15, 16 years, to start hearing some of the cities where they're opening offices is really encouraging, because they're responding to demand in those areas to provide more direct service to students in those markets. And that's encouraging for institutions that are looking to better dive into India as a market. They've maybe always had success on the graduate level, might be starting to look for some success on the undergrad level, but also expand maybe the diversity of students from India that are coming to their institutions, because it is an amazingly broad and diverse country that has some amazing students in some very unique places. And I think I was at an institution that once that had probably 95% of its Indian students were from one location in India, one state in India, and that had an impact on the rest. But there's so much potential in India to grow, not just at the graduate level, but also at the undergraduate level. IDP expanding there is a positive sign. I think that's certainly welcome. What I would say on the kind of the far extreme of this, another story is happened in Quebec. We talked last week in Canada about Ontario colleges, public colleges, and a lot of them vocational schools or private vocational schools that are heavily dependent on Indian students. I think it was 68% of international students at these these colleges, vocational colleges in Ontario, were from India. In India-wide, or countrywide in Canada, India is the number one source for students. I think they're closing in on 50% there of their international students are from India. Across the country. But this story comes from CBC in Quebec, talking about three private colleges, Quebec private colleges, more like the vocational ones that we're talking about with Ontario last week, have filed for creditor protection. That because they've had some major hits over the last couple of years, and have basically left. And there's a recruiting firm, plus three colleges are all part of this kind of network of colleges and this recruitment firm that are heavily dependent on international students for these vocational colleges. There's been a history the last couple of years. 10 private colleges last year were suspended by the province, including the three that we're talking about here, for what was described as questionable recruitment practices for students in India. And that suspension meant that the schools were temporarily prevented from accepting certain foreign student applications, and that the province investigated the college and looked into these issues. What is just boggling the mind, those students that were caught in the lurch, that were sold a bill of goods, are now asking for refunds. They've paid $28,000 to $30,000 to attend these schools and over a 2-year period. And what is just boggles the mind here, these three colleges that have just filed for creditor protection, the ones that have been prevented last year from recruiting internationally or bringing in certain students from abroad, they have, among their total students at the three colleges, 95%, there are 1,177 students at the three colleges, 95% of these are students, all students, not just domestic students and international students, all students, 95% are from India. And that's not sustainable. And when you no wonder they're filing for creditor protection. They haven't been able to recruit students. And when 95% of your students come from one country, and that country is where the source of the problems are in terms of the recruitment practices that they've been accused of, then yeah, you're going to need protection. So no surprise that this happened. But certainly it's a cautionary tale for, we talk about becoming overly dependent on any one country for your international students. A number of U.S. colleges bought into the China gravy train back in the early noughties, and they've paid the consequences 15 years later, where those numbers have dropped off a cliff because they didn't really invest long term. They just rode the gravy train, didn't really do anything to maintain it. Some schools have. They've developed offices and strong relationships in country, so they've survived. But when you have 30-40% of your international students, or more in this case, 95% of your total student body from one country, and you have issues there, then you're going to have some creditor problems, and much bigger problems indeed than that. But India is going to continue to be, and increasingly so, I think, a major supplier of students, and I think relationships, college to college relationships will grow as though probably not as quickly as we might like in the United States with the new national education policy. It's going to take years to implement, and the formal agreements on in-country campuses is going to be limited, but agreements certainly are starting to move forward. So we'll see. We'll certainly track that, and I think in certain countries it's going to be much more important to have stronger presence in India than others. So that's all we have for you today on the Roundup. I appreciate you sticking with us for this extended episode, but a lot of meaty topics here today, and we look forward to chatting with you again in the days and weeks to come. Cheers.